always going to be another problem. There's
Always.
gonna be.
Always. And so how long have you been a part of the organization?
I have worked with North Coast Ship Crisis Team for 8 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you've been there for some time.
Yeah, I started when I was 19 years old. I was a part-time on-call advocate. So we serve Humboldt and Del Norte County.
Okay.
And so I was up in Crescent City, and I started as a part-time on-call advocate. So I was on call 2 weekends a month and in the office 2 days. And then I became full-time, moved here, and now I'm the education and outreach manager.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And how long did you say you've been there? Just a couple months.
Yeah, so I started full time last November. So it's been a little while. And then I think I started part time, like going through training in September. So officially it's been like 9 months, I think, or 8 months, but full time like 6.
9 months, 8 years. You guys are out there putting in some work.
Yeah.
And is that kind of where you guys are at now, as you're trying to recruit new people, bring on new team members, kind of just get more exposure in the community?
Yeah, so oh, sorry, I thought you were like closer.
Oh, no, I'm just over here wiping the sweat off of my face. Might need to invest in like a rag I could just have sitting
There
right
we
somewhere.
go.
Yeah.
So we have pretty much all of the our full-time staff. So we have full-time staff that we have in office, but we're always recruiting for our volunteer program. So we have pretty new. It started, I believe, like February of last year, and we go through and recruit people. Our next cohort's going to potentially be in August. And we get a lot of like Cal Poly Humboldt grad students, but it's open to anybody. And so we ask for like a year commitment. They go through an 80+ hour sexual assault counselor training. And for our volunteers, the expectation isn't to respond out as like we do. If we're holding the hotline and we get a call, we respond out. But for volunteers, the ask is just to like answer the phone, communicate with our full-time advocates, and take crisis calls.
And what does respond out mean? You reach out to them and try to do a follow-up, or?
Yeah, so we, as advocates, there is like laws in California that like when a sexual assault is reported through law enforcement, that they legally have to call us. We have MOUs with them and the hospital. So if somebody presents and names that they've experienced a sexual assault, we get called. And so we respond out to law enforcement interviews. We respond out to the hospital. We respond out to homes if law enforcement is present. And so that's like our 24-hour crisis response. So we're there with somebody through the initial interview process, potentially the medical forensic exam or the rape kit SART exam. And then we provide like ongoing advocacy and accompaniments through like if they have a second interview with law enforcement or it's going through the criminal justice process. We can go to court with the person, or we can go there. We call them court watches because people don't have to go to court, but we can go there, get the information, and report back to the survivor directly.
And so is your guys' role in that more passive, or are you just there to kind of provide support, or do you take a more active kind of speaker role in that, an advocacy role, where you guys are speaking on their behalf in some regard and trying to walk them through the process?
We never want to speak for the survivor, but we
speak through them.
Yes,
I guess would be more.
Yeah. So if somebody
apropos.
doesn't feel comfortable like sharing something with law enforcement, the hard thing is that we can't be in the. I'm gonna lose it. What is it? Like the evidence. We can't be in the line of evidence. So if a survivor shares something with us in confidence and wants us to share that with law enforcement, we can't like speak for them. Otherwise, it's coming from us and we could get subpoenaed. But we could kind of like let the survivor know, like, remember what you shared with me, or would you be okay talking a little bit about like what we just talked about with them? So we're with them through the whole process. And we're also kind of the go-between because there's a lot of legal jargon. There's a lot of steps. And so we're kind of just guiding them through like, this is what's happening next. Are you okay with that? If law enforcement or another entity is victim blaming, the survivor doesn't feel comfortable, we do step in and we say like, this person needs a break, or can we step outside and have a conversation? You know, those kinds of things. So we do mediate kind of the process in general, just kind of like to interject if things are like going astray or
Starting to go a little sideways.
Yeah. Then we're like, let's take a break. So
Well, you have to think that when you guys are going out there and meeting these people, they're not having the best day. And so on top of the stress of what they went through in their experience, then they're meeting with cops. They're almost reliving it again to try to explain what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine it'd be pretty beneficial having somebody there that kind of gets it, can walk you through the process, almost hold your hand as you're enduring what you are.
Yeah, and we go past that as well. And we've experienced, and we shared this with law enforcement when we get a call out, because law enforcement doesn't always give us a call, even though they're supposed to. And we understand, like, when you're responding on scene in that moment, that you're wanting to, get the ball rolling. And, we have a 30-minute response time where it usually doesn't take us the full 30 minutes to get there. We just have that because we have people who live in, McKinleyville. And if we're responding out to Eureka, it's going to take a minute, those kinds of things. And so sometimes law enforcement doesn't want to wait. And so they don't give us a call, or they offer our services to the survivor and they're like, no, I don't want another person in the room. They don't want to feel like they're putting somebody out, or, creating more energy around something that maybe they don't want the focus on. I don't know where I was going with that, but so
That
like,
makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, so law enforcement doesn't always give us a call, but we've noticed that when we do respond out and there is an advocate present, that survivor is more likely to go through the criminal justice process, because for a lot of people, they go through that initial interview or they go through the SART exam and they do have to relive it. And when you do the initial interview, you're reliving it. You're sharing your experience of what happened. And for a lot of law enforcement, that's from a linear standpoint. So like from what happened before the assault, during, and then your response afterwards. And then same for the medical forensic exam. They have their own list of questions. So you do the interview with law enforcement. They determine if you're eligible for a SART exam. And then you go through the medical forensic exam, which has an interview portion, and then it has the physical examination. So that's 2 times within a span of potentially 4 hours having to relive your experience.
And with 2 separate people. It's not even
Mhm.
reliving it to the same person again. You got to retell it to some other stranger.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
if it goes through the criminal justice system, or so there's a SART exam, that evidence gets collected, law enforcement does their investigation, and sometimes they request the survivor to come back and answer a few different questions, or, they get some information, they want to relay that with the survivor, those kinds of things. So that might be a second interview, potentially a third. And then it goes to the district attorney's office. They decide if they want to charge that case or not. And then they also have a DA investigator who might have their own set of questions. So you're talking to the DA's office. And then going through the court process, if it goes to trial, there's a preliminary hearing. If you are an adult, you're most likely going to have to testify in the preliminary hearing. If you're a minor, there's a thing called Prop 115, where the responding law enforcement officer who took your initial interview, or an officer who was on the case, can testify on your behalf of the knowledge that they have and what they put in their report. But if you're an adult, that's you.
Is that just to protect the identity of the minor in
Yeah.
that situation?
Yeah, and also not to like re-traumatize. So they try not to re-traumatize the survivor through the process. That's not the goal. Or the goal is to not re-traumatize. But with minors too, there's also the higher chance of, once the evidence is being shown in court, that the perpetrator or the defendant is like, cut it. I want a plea deal. I want to take a plea, because they don't want it to go to trial and be seen in front of a jury. So we see that a lot of times too, especially with minor cases, that when it's Prop 115 and the law enforcement officer is testifying on their behalf and all the evidence is laid out, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm screwed. Like, oh, this is going to be
It's
bad.
not going to end well for me.
Exactly. And so then they see the plea. And so there's also that piece. But if you're an adult going through that, you're asked to testify in the preliminary hearing and then at trial as well. So it's like a total of like 6 to 7 times that you could have to share your experience in a linear way through that process.
What determines if it will go with criminal proceedings? If when you go into the hospital, I would imagine they do a rape kit. That would be step 1. That's just my CSI background,
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the process for that?
I don't want to burst anyone's bubbles. It's not like SVU. It's not like SVU
Shocking.
at all. Shockingly, it's not like SVU at all. We have no Olivia Bensons out here. The SART exam itself doesn't necessarily like prove that somebody experienced a sexual assault. And a lot of times, even if like harm happened, that there might not be DNA evidence, or it takes a lot of months for the stuff to get processed through DOJ. So we're seeing at like 6 months or more turnaround
6
for
months
DNA
out.
evidence. And so the investigation will move forward without getting that back as well. So if they're naming like, oh, from their story and who they're able to kind of talk to, if there's witnesses that were present who can cooperate, or if there's a lot of times it's like text messages, voicemails, Snapchats, those kinds of things, if there's things to cooperate their evidence. But I've experienced times where I'm like, oh, this is going to get prosecuted by the DA's office for sure. Like, this feels like a strong case, and they decide not to move forward. So it's really on who's prosecuting it, and if they feel like, there's enough to move forward. Because a lot of times, especially with sexual assaults, it's like a he said, she said. So there's not a witness.
And
There's not a lot of cooperating.
Yeah, they want that beyond a reasonable doubt. Like, for sure, we can successfully prosecute. So,
Which is frustrating if you're the victim or even you guys, and the evidence isn't quite there, but you kind of do know that it happened, and it's just overcoming that barrier of, okay, where's the evidence for this?
Yeah. Well, and it's hard, like, especially for survivors, it's a hard place for us to be in because, the DA's office is coming forward and saying, there's not enough evidence for us to move forward, or we can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt, or, X, Y, and Z. And then, like, not so much in recent years, but in the past, the DA's office would like share information with us to then share with the survivor. So we would be the ones relaying the information of like, your case isn't moving forward and here's why. And we can set up a meeting with the DA to talk about it. But then that's, processing like, why wasn't my statement good enough? What could have I done differently? And
Well,
so
that's almost an unfair burden to put on you guys. Kicking the ball down, saying, okay, their case didn't go through, but you guys need to break the news to them. You're going to tell them, hey, sorry.
Yeah. Which, I mean, it's hard because but for a lot of times, like, we do have a different relationship with survivors because we do offer that, like, we have our hotline. We have one-on-one peer counseling. We're the ones relaying a lot of the information regarding court. We're dealing with a lot of the emotional, like, not turmoil, but like the emotional burnout of the process itself, as well as processing the assault itself, the trauma itself. So it's also like it's navigating these systems as well as your own personal healing through that. And for a lot of people, they tie their healing with like the turnout from the judicial system. So they're like, if this person is held liable, then, these people believed me. And, I haven't met a DA or an advocate from another system that just blatantly was like, I do not believe you. I've never experienced that. They always come from a place of like, we believe what you shared with us and we're so sorry that it happened. There's just not enough for us to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Or for a lot of times they'll also make the decision of like, if this is going to be, too much of a mental burden on the survivor where they think that they might not be able to like be on the stand. So they're like, looking out for them in their own way. It just doesn't feel validating when you're that person who put everything on the line sometimes.
Does that recovery process extend if the person that is accused of these crimes isn't found guilty? So rather than maybe them processing through this experience in a year or two, it is now 3 or 4 years or 5 years? I mean, is there a hold time on that because of that?
So healing's not linear in general. And so for a lot of survivors, we've seen like once that court happened and maybe that person was found, accountable or guilty, that they're like, okay, that weight's lifted off their shoulders of that burden. But we connect with survivors whether they're going through the criminal process or not. So whether somebody reports or not, we still connect with them. And so we see like the waves will come. So a lot of times around like anniversaries or different times of like the year is really hard or, different things like that. So even if somebody's case doesn't go through to trial, our services are always available. And so we do see a lot of times that people might take a break afterwards and they might come back and be like, I still feel a little like unrest around this. So it just kind of ebbs and flows. We also serve a lot of survivors who've never reported to law enforcement. And so we offer our counseling services, other things like that. But for a lot of people, maybe they don't have a great experience with law enforcement. It was, ongoing from a partner. When we're tabling, a lot of the times when we're tabling, we get a lot of people who just come up to our booth and share that they've experienced assault many years ago, and they say like, I've never told anybody this, but like, thank you for what you're doing. Those kinds of things. So we also have a lot of people who just don't share their experience. And we serve a lot of older clients as well who just have never shared their experience. And so they see our hotline somewhere, or they've seen like our bus ads or those kinds of things. And they were like, I just wanted to talk to somebody about this. We're like, we're here to listen.
Do you notice a difference in the people that come forward and maybe do try to go down the prosecution route, or at least come forward to talk to you guys, versus the ones that are a little more suppressive in it and try to just bury it down and ignore that it happened?
Yeah.
I mean, is there like a tangible difference you can see in those people, or how they recover from that, or it's pretty hard to say? It just varies too much.
I,
Yeah, go for it.
I think it varies. I think it varies because it's so hard to kind of also like navigate of like, oh, who comes forward and who doesn't. Because I mean, we connect with, our primary work is in high schools currently. We run like the Check It Club that Cal Poly Humboldt has. We run a model of that at like Arcata High primarily. But we're at like the high school level. And so we also get disclosures from teens as well who just don't want to report to law enforcement. So like there's not like a marker of like, these people typically don't report to law enforcement compared to somebody else.
Right. No identifiers that you guys can point
No.
out.
Yeah. It doesn't really negate off of age either.
Yeah.
We notice a lot of times like past experience with law enforcement's a big one. Like if they've had an ongoing relationship with law enforcement, or if it's not their first assault that they've experienced.
They're less likely to come forward if it's not their first one. Wow.
Potentially. So that's what I've personally seen. If somebody has, or if they have experienced an assault and they did report it to law enforcement and there wasn't like an outcome, or it didn't move forward, then they're less likely to come forward again.
Yeah, that's what I was going to kind of say is like, if someone isn't necessarily wanting to report to law enforcement, it doesn't mean that they're not wanting to talk about it to anybody. It's just like, oh, they may have a barrier from a bad experience before, or just maybe not ready to do it in that way, or their healing journey doesn't look like wanting prosecution, right? They're just wanting to heal on their own and things like that. So I don't think it's, everyone's so different, right? And so if someone does decide to go through the process, great, that's what they want to do. But if not, I think that doesn't mean that they aren't gonna be talking about it openly and like healing. It's some people that's part of the healing process, and some people it's not. So
Well, it has to be challenging working through stigma, especially around cops from the past. Because what I've heard, and again, this is just a layman's perspective of somebody not involved, is that coming forward with a case like this to officers in the past, you might have been not necessarily just brushed aside, but it wouldn't translate to anything. And so now that times kind of have changed and people are more willing to go down this road with people and at least investigate and see where the evidence lies, you almost have to overcome those preconceived notions of, well, if I go to the cops, nothing's going to happen, so I might as well not even try. Whereas now you probably should try because it might actually go somewhere and you might be able to get some closure.
yeah, I mean, still like a lot of times it doesn't, isn't prosecuted still, and so
But is that a result of lack of effort on the police, or it's just that evidence? What does that translate from?
It's hard to pinpoint because, I mean, we're not in law enforcement. So we're also on the outside perspective. So, like, we don't know the ins and outs of their investigation. Like, we're calling to get updates or, like, different things like that. But we're not, like, in the trenches with law enforcement doing, like, the active investigation unless, the survivor's getting called in to do, like a phone call with them or different things like that. So, I mean, it's hard to kind of pinpoint, like, where the pieces aren't falling into place.
Where it kind of falls off the cliff.
Yeah. And I mean, when reporting, like, these crimes in itself are really hard to prosecute. And when we're talking about like sexualized violence too, there is also like that preconceived of like a lot of the times these people who are reporting, this is somebody that they know. This is somebody that is either have like a prior intimate connection with, a friend of a friend, somebody who has access to this person. So there's also a relationship between the survivor and the perpetrator a lot of the times that makes it really hard to come forward and saying like, I don't want to see this person in jail. I just want to see this person, name what they did to me. Or those kinds of feelings too. So law enforcement's also been fickle of like, well, if we move forward, this person might go to jail. And this person is naming that they don't want this person to go to jail. And then, I can't say where it falls apart for a lot of people, or like where the investigation doesn't come to like fruition through court. But there are quite a few that do. And so it's kind of like that dice roll. And my experience there are some law enforcement agencies that are more in tune to connecting with us than others. That's just how it is. And there are some really great like detectives and investigators and officers who do their due diligence and are really open and transparent with the survivor about like what's going on through that process. And there are others who aren't. And so it's also, the dice roll of who you get when responding out. That's also a big factor of like who's showing up when you're making a report really does change on the trajectory of like how this might go.
Do you think it's a good thing, in your guys' opinion, that burden of proof is so high, or do you think there are cases where it could be a little less stringent? Because the thing that always gets tossed around is, well, people sometimes make false accusations. There are some people that are not necessarily the most upstanding and might be more willing to lie just in general. Do you guys buy into that, or you think... I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, right?
Like, statistically, less than 2% of people who come forward are false reports. And that also counts for those people who recant their story. So if somebody's facing retaliation or they had a bad interview with law enforcement and they say, I don't want to do this anymore, that's also counted in that statistic of false reporting because they're recanting their story. So less than 2% of reports made to law enforcement are false reports. And I believe it's like less than 60% of survivors ever make a report to law enforcement. So when we're looking at it from that perspective of like the amount of harm that's happening compared to the amount of harm that's reported, it's astronomical. And so there is a stigma around false reporting, and that if somebody's coming forward and they've had a history of making reports, if they have a history of like mental health or addiction, they're viewed through a different lens. And when we're talking about sexualized violence and we're talking about perpetrators, they're looking for vulnerable populations or people that they can easily, manipulate or harm or, those kinds of outward things. They're not looking for credible people. If it's somebody who's like, it's like a stranger or different things like that. And those ones seem to be more believed than the intimate partner who, crossed the line that there wasn't consent, but there's an ongoing relationship. So the lines are blurred. Those kinds of cases are the ones where they're like, and it's frustrating because you're validating that survivor in that place of, was this consensual for you? Did this person ask you? Did they say yes? How did you feel? And all the lines are saying that's an assault. And so we're validating that person in their experience. All of our advocates in our agency, we come from a place of believing. So that's the first place that we come to when somebody comes to us and they share their experience. We say that we believe them. And sometimes survivors with trauma and compounded trauma, things aren't linear. And so someone's coming and connecting with us and their story's all over the place. They're in a really high traumatic place. Majority of the time, the people who reach out to us they experience something extremely traumatic and they're connecting with us about that trauma. It's not about just like, oh, how's your day going? This is happening in real time. They could be actively triggered. They could have seen their perpetrator and they're hyperventilating and they're calling our hotline to try to, ground themselves. And so we're not coming from that like ABC place of law enforcement where we're trying to figure out the whodunit. We're just there to listen. And so around like reporting or different things like that, it's really hard when like law enforcement's naming like, oh, I don't believe this person, but we're always going to come from a place of believing, even if the dots don't make sense in the moment.
Yeah, and what we know about trauma in the brain is that things aren't linear, and so it can be hard to be like, oh, this is how things exactly happened, and so that can make things hard to prosecute when they're, oh, did you change your story? But really, like, their brain is what went into the survival state, and is really hard to remember exactly what happened and present it in a way exactly the same every time. So. To go back to like what we were talking about earlier and like prosecuting barriers, I could see how trauma affects the brain being one of those. And maybe, if everyone's not the most trauma informed, they might not understand that these are reactions to trauma.
Well, and the preconceived stigma that you kind of touched on must be challenging. Because if you have a bad person and something bad like this happens to them, it still happened to them.
Yeah.
And just because they might not be the most upstanding citizen doesn't mean that their case shouldn't be treated regardless of that and handled appropriately as if they were anybody else.
Yeah. Investigated at the very least.
Yeah.
interview someone, something like that. Like it's hard. And especially if somebody's experienced harm in the past, when somebody experiences a new trauma or a new sexual assault, sometimes those assaults blend in the brain. And so when they're retelling their story, they might throw in a piece of, a memory that they had from a past assault that was triggering during the newest assault. And so it's,
Overlaps a little bit.
Yeah. And so we have, this opportunity as advocates to be able to kind of like break through a lot of that and have those conversations when it's like other service avenues, or when you're reporting, they have these lines that they're looking for, that they're, I need this information to do X, Y, and Z. And if the information's not accurate, or, it's back and forth, like they can't do their job. And so there's also that limbo too. And it's just, it's a hard place to be in sometimes when we're trying to navigate of like, did this happen last month, or was this something that happened from an assault 5 years ago? Let's navigate that.
Do you think that the stigma around, oh, some people might lie, that whole idea, do you think that's more discrediting to the movement as a whole? People are kind of blowing that out of proportion in some sense, and that it's almost having the opposite effect because then people become desensitized to these cases when they do come forward? Or do you think there's still validity in looking at those cases and saying, yeah, that 2%, not a huge number, 2%.
Yeah. No, I mean, there are people who come forward and name that they, or make a false report. That is accurate. I think the climate and like coming at every time somebody comes forward as, is this person lying? I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's a good place to
It's
sit
safer
in.
to assume the 98%
Yeah.
than the 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think that's used as a scapegoat for a lot of people of not facing the actual problem, that harm happens. And I think especially here I'm going to shout out rural communities, here in small towns, somebody. If somebody's coming forward and they're naming somebody as a perpetrator, and let's say that's your brother's best friend, you're not going to sit there and be like, well, or someone can sit there and be like, well, they were never weird to me. They didn't do anything to me. I know this person. And so if you don't know that person who's coming forward and saying this person harmed me, you're going to stick up for your friend. And here in small communities, like word of mouth is huge. So if somebody already has, a reputation, or if they've came forward and let's say they recanted, maybe they even make a report to law enforcement, maybe they talked to a school counselor, and that triggered a report. And then they're saying, I don't want to move forward with this. And everybody at school is calling them a liar. Because the person who caused them harm, let's say they have friends, they have a support system, they come from a good family, that's a good kid. You're just trying to discredit, you're going to ruin that kid's life. That's what's put on that other person. You're going to ruin that person's life. As a community, you don't want to assume that harm happens here, and you don't want to face that. It's just a reality. You want to think that your neighborhoods are safe, that you're, that you can send your kid to school and there not be any harm. We want to believe that. And the reality is that harm happens everywhere, and everybody is vulnerable to harm. And it's also the same for, when male survivors come forward. There's that stigma, there's homophobia, there's all of these other barriers of like, why didn't, oh, he was assaulted by a girl, didn't he want it? Those kinds of things. Like there's gender stereotypes that come into play. There is alienation if you're, not in the majority, if you're in any minority. And so there's just a lot of overlapping things that make it really hard for people to, one, come forward, and to go through that process and like see it all the way through.
The crazy thing is that everybody knows somebody, or most people
Mhm.
know somebody that's been through it. I mean, I can remember back in high school having friends that would, maybe casually bring it up one night or something and start
Mhm.
talking about it. And you're like, what? But on the flip side, I've also talked to people who, of course, I can't be 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure have told me something and formulated a whole lie. So I think I'm
Mhm.
not necessarily jaded in that regard. Because if somebody tells me, I'm going to instantly believe you, because why? I wouldn't assume that you would lie. I would just always give
Yeah.
somebody the
Mhm.
benefit of that
Yeah.
doubt. But it is also in the back of my head that some people do lie.
Mhm.
And I think people can go off the ropes with that and start thinking, oh, that translates to everybody lies. And so we should go into the situation assuming they're lying until they're proven innocent. And I think in a court of law, you shouldn't go down that route. You should maintain the neutrality of let's just see where the information lies. And I think people get tripped up outside of a court of law of just, I know somebody that might have lied, so now everybody's a liar.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it just, you're kind of just rolling back the ball in the progress.
Everybody's an at-home Olivia Benson. Everybody's a whodunit, a Facebook investigator.
Especially nowadays, right? Everybody's doing their own research. Everybody's digging into everything.
Mhm.
And within the media, if someone, you know, does make a false report, that's going to get
Way more
blown up and
traction.
way more exposure than something that happens all the time, you know, which is people telling the truth about what happens. And that sexual violence is very rampant in our society, unfortunately. But just within that culture, I think media definitely attaches to those and kind of blows those out of proportion, kind of like you were talking about.
Mhm.
Well, the Amber Heard case,
Yeah.
I mean, what was your guys' take on that where you are so close to these issues, seeing that thing unfold?
I personally only watch the lives on TikTok. So I didn't sit down and
TikTok
watch.
sleuth, yep.
Yeah, so I was like, okay, I watched some of it. So I didn't see a lot of the testimony of it. I also know these are two big
High profile
Yeah.
actors.
so it's going to get a lot of traction, a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And a lot of people know Johnny Depp over Amber Heard. You know what I mean? So that also had, this person is, Jack Sparrow. Oh no. So there's also those preconceived notions, but I didn't watch the trial at all except for TikTok lives. So I was like, okay.
And that was before I was with the agency too, so I didn't
Not
have a-
necessarily in your purview.
as much.
Yeah, some of our advocates are really some of our teammates are really into keeping up with all of the media cases and those kinds of things. For myself, I got to be really mindful of burnout, and so I have to navigate what I'm consuming on media because I will get into a rabbit hole of it. So
I can slip into that a lot.
Yeah.
You Google one thing and then 3 hours later it's 4 a.m. and you're still looking at these things.
Yep.
The Amber Heard case I thought was fascinating. I was talking to a friend about it, and her biggest point is she felt she was mad that there was, to some extent, so much attention around it after the verdict came out because she felt like it was going to discredit future people from coming forward, regardless that she was found guilty and
Yeah.
that's what the court decided. She didn't think that was so much really relevant to the case. It was that now that there was this case that this happened and it didn't go in her way, future survivors might not get the benefit of the doubt. And so we should kind of sweep that case under the rug to some sense, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I was like, that's an interesting way of looking at this, that because it didn't pan out how society almost would have wanted it to pan out, now we kind of need to just
not do any more of that.
yeah, drop that
Don't
one.
look at it.
Yeah, don't look at that one. It didn't go our way. Drop it. Let's move on to the next one.
Yeah. Well, it's important to look at even the cases that don't go in the favor of survivors. They still went through the criminal justice process and looking at, how did they come to this verdict? What kind of things systematically were playing against them? When we're talking about going to a trial, I mean that you're sitting in front of 12 jurors who, have their own set of ideals. And so that also plays into it because even if you're coming in saying you're unbiased, everybody has a bias. Nobody is truly unbiased, in my opinion. Somebody always has something that they fundamentally believe. We all have a set of beliefs, and so we're all going to have a set of biases. So sitting there and being like, I'm unbiased, I have no opinion. You have an opinion.
Well, especially around something charged like this.
Yes.
I mean, nobody is just completely impartial when it comes to difficult subjects, especially as it relates to if it's kids that are going through it or younger adults. To stay impartial in those situations is incredibly challenging.
Yeah. I know for myself, I've been called up to do your jury duty, your civic duty. And they ask you if I can be unbiased. And I'm like, no. And this is why. This is what I do for work. Those kinds of things. And so easy to get dismissed from a jury. You just say I'm not biased. So I don't know. Around that, I'm like, people have a bias. People have an opinion.
Do you feel like where you guys are kind of working in this field and you're around it so much, do you feel like you're almost jaded in the opposite way? Because I don't want to say you're coming face to face with the worst of humanity in some sense, but you're coming face to face with these kind of traumatic experiences, and you're seeing them, I would imagine, fairly constantly because you guys are
Mhm.
an organization and you're still in business and everything seems to be
Yeah.
going well for you. So I would imagine there are cases coming your way. Does that,
Mhm.
I mean, do you ever have to like take a couple weeks and just decompress or try to find some grounding again? Or how do you work through that?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, self care is very important within the work that we do. So I've definitely like, obviously, I'm new, started last year, but there's kind of a silver lining with that because I've had to teach myself like more self care skills and like be really good about that. So that's huge. But trying to remember the rest of your question.
Just, uh, I mean, the thing you hear with cops, right, is burnout
Yeah.
because you're coming up on scene. Sometimes there's dead bodies, sometimes there's mutilated kids. There are these
Yeah.
really extreme
Yeah.
circumstances, and you guys are seeing this very singular set of
Mhm.
extreme circumstances where people are going through an experience they didn't necessarily ask for,
Mhm.
and that's all you're seeing when you go to work. I go to work, I sit here, I could crack a beer, I get to talk to interesting people.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have kind of depressing conversations at 10 o'clock in the morning,
Yeah.
sometimes great ones, but you guys are in the thick of it, and I would
Mhm.
imagine that would have to weigh on you in some regard. I mean, you talked about burnout. I would
Mhm.
imagine maintaining people that don't get jaded and that have a clear head and can work through these is incredibly important. How do you just get by? Does it just become a job and you get a little desensitized in some regard? Do you have to become desensitized so you can get through it?
I've done this work for a hot minute. I started this work at 19. So I
Which is
think I just
crazy for a 19-year-old to say, "Yep, I'm going to go down.
I'm
I'm
gonna
going to do
do
this."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I can't remember. I think I rewired my brain a little bit of like this is just what you have to get used to. I also think that people that come specifically into this work come for a reason. They're connected to it in some way. Either there's a personal impact or there is a connection to somebody in their life that they love that they want to do this work. They want to connect with survivors and they want to provide that gap. Um, Realistically, the turnover in our work is about 2 years. Somebody lasts about 2 years in our job and then they, for personal reasons, other things like that, different opportunities come up in their life where they're like, here we go. We also get a lot of people who have like freshly graduated. And so they're like, this is their stepping stone. They realize
It's a big step.
this is a big step. But like self-care is important. We this last year we got a new executive director, Amanda LeBlanc. Shout out, she is amazing. She has completely changed our organization for the better. We used to not have open business hours where we had like a public office where people could come in and receive one-on-one crisis interventions or walk in and receive services. Now we do. We have a space in Arcata that's open to the public. We have a space in Crescent City that's open to the public. We have monthly self-care days where we come together as an office. We usually involves food. It's gonna be completely transparent. Involves food.
It's a good way to bring people in.
Yeah.
Hey, we've got some snacks.
Yeah, so we have food, we make like a craft together, we do like vision boards, self-love, different things like that. So our agency dynamic is very much of like taking care of ours and our own so we can take care of others. Family comes first. We prioritize family within our agency. We have advocates who have kids, young kids, your daycare's not working out, like bring your kid in for a little bit, that kind of thing. Or, involving our family in like the work that we do of like creating support, having open times where people can come in or, oh, my partner's driving through Arcata, I'm going to step out and have lunch with them.
Mhm.
If we're having a hard day, Amanda's the first person to say, can you go home? If you need to go home, if you need to take care of yourself, what do you need? We really try to prioritize self-care in our everyday work life. And then independently, we also like, what do you do to take care of yourself? We start that in the training. So we give people like after every, module, we're like, so what are you going to do to take care of yourself now? Because you just learned for 3 hours about child sexual abuse.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to take care of yourself? Make yourself a meal, go for a walk, those kinds of things. And so I like to think that we're really all in tune with each other in the office. So if somebody's having an off day, we can kind of like feel, we always case. So if somebody has a really hard case that they're going through, we provide extra support. We ask if they want another advocate there, those kinds of things. So there are different levels of like trauma response and care within our own agency too. So that also helps. And that wasn't always the case. And so I think that's like something that in these last few months we've really prioritized, and I definitely like see a difference. Because before,
It was a little challenging.
very challenging. It's hard, and it's also like it's a very one-on-one job, because when we're going out and we're responding, there's just one of us. And so we're connecting with that person. You build a connection with that person, especially, you know, they're responding. You're there that at the initial interview a lot of the times, and then you're there through the whole court process. So we really get to see the growth and healing and that connection with that survivor, which for a lot of our advocates, that feeds something for them. You know, this is an equal exchange for a lot of people of, you know, I know when I work with clients and I work with survivors and I do one-on-one, you know, counseling, peer counseling with them, and I leave a session and I feel rejuvenated. Like, yeah, we just talked for an hour about some really hard shit. Sorry, like really hard
No,
stuff.
you can cuss on it. Yeah, you're
Okay.
good.
We talk about some really hard shit, and like you unearth a lot, but you also get to see the growth in somebody else, and like you get to see them their life change, and you get to see, you know, the happiness and all those other things kind of return, and you know, you ride the wave with them, and it's really rewarding to see somebody come out from something so traumatic on like the other side and see that, you know, see people's personalities change and grow, and like their jokes and different stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like some of the survivors that I work with are the most funniest people I've ever met in my life, and that helps.
Is there a sense or an aspect of trauma bonding that you have to be careful of? That where you are going through this experience pretty adjacent to this person, that you can kind of slip into this trap where you take on a lot of what they went through, and then that builds up from person that you're working with to person that you're working with?
Yeah, vicarious trauma is huge, especially when we're responding on scene. You know, I responded on scene to people's apartments where there was blood on the floor and like different things like that. So I mean, very much like a first responder. And then talking and navigating, we really prioritize boundaries, not just for ourselves, but for the survivors. Because I mean, we have a 24-hour hotline, but that doesn't mean I'm available 24/7. And so for a lot of people, they get really connected with that person who responded out and was there holding their hand, was there through that, which, you know, we want to foster those bonds in a safe way. We're also not the only support system that this person needs. It takes a network of people. And so like, we really have to be clear of, you know, I'm available these days, or, you know, I might not answer every time you call my work phone. I'm not on all the time, but our hotline is available. And so navigating, you know, not just myself being that person, but also like offering and saying like, oh, this is my teammate, Makhi, you know, and like, so they know who everybody is, so they feel comfortable reaching out to all of us and not just the singular, because that's really hard.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is really like identifying how much we can do, because you know, we are there for a lot of people in a lot of ways, but there are some things where a big part of what we do is referrals. So, you know, peer counseling can only go so far, and a lot of what we do is like identifying their needs and like, okay, this is what you want to do this form of therapy, let's try and find someone who can help you with that, and then we can do like a warm handoff.
Well, yeah, setting boundaries, I would imagine, is critical to doing your job effectively, because that would just feed into the burnout. If somebody gets attached to you and then you obviously feel compelled to be available to them, and then you're working 24/7, and it's all adding up.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like, it's a human need to be like wanted. And so for a lot of people too, if like you build a connection with somebody, you want to be there. And it's not that we're like, no, we don't want you to be there for them. It's like, you got to take care of yourself. Otherwise it's going to be burnout. If we're just giving and giving from an empty cup, it's going to run dry. And so really prioritizing, like, if you give everything to this one person, you're not going to be able to be there for all of these other people. Because I mean, our caseloads vary too sometimes, because I primarily do education, so my caseload has gotten a lot lower over the years. I used to be in direct client services, so I was navigating about like 8 clients, and so now I hold about 3.
At any given time.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I was gonna add that some of our team is just in direct client services, right? And luckily, at least I feel lucky being a part of the education team. So we're doing outreach tabling. We're going into high schools and doing prevention education. And I think that's really rewarding as well. But also like less burnout and more like creativity and things like that. Just a different outlet, you know?
Is that where people normally get started? Is the education side, or do they go right into direct intervention?
Direct.
Right
So,
into
yeah.
the, or you guys throw them to the fire. You say, well,
Yeah.
you're either going to make it or you're not.
Yep, that first, right? Usually?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because to do this educational piece, you need to have like the fundamentals of like the services that we provide, because people
experience.
people ask us those hard-hitting questions. They talk about health supporting. I can't tell you how many times we do like a public, presentation, and it's, it's the non-believers who speak up. They're the people who are like,
The most vocal.
yeah, we get asked a lot of times of like, well, how many people do you serve? And I'm like, over 200 a year. Like, do you want me to pull up our grant numbers? Like, we're a business. We're not a business. We're an agency here that provides services, and we've been here for over 40 years. We are a needed service.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to tell you that. Our doors are still open.
Yeah, and there's a reason. And these spaces for these people didn't always exist, but they're needed.
Well, we're in an interesting day where I think most people acknowledge that this is happening and acknowledge that it is a problem. But that wasn't always the case. I mean, you go back a couple decades, you go back 100 years.
Yeah.
Good luck. What? Oh, somebody did something to you? Okay.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah,
Go
so-
on about your day, which, I mean, looking at it from our lens, which is a challenge to do because culture changes, society changes, people change. It's just almost crazy to look back. But I mean, you go back a couple hundred years and people were just slaughtering each other. So it's not that much of a jump that this would be happening as well.
Yeah, like I said, when we do tabling, because last summer we did a lot of networking at like farmers markets. So we'd go to all of the rural and local farmers markets, and we had people who were, I want to say, between the ages of like 70 and 80. And we would have multiple people come up every time, and they would share that they experienced assault when they were, 12, 14, 16, and they never told anybody, or they told their parent, but it didn't go anywhere. And they said, like, there wasn't a service like you around, and I'm really thankful that you guys are here. And they're like, I would have really benefited from talking to somebody like you. And we always say, like, our doors are always open. It doesn't matter when that assault occurred. You can always connect with us. And they're like, no, I'm okay now, or those kinds of things. But I always have to tell people when we go table, I'm like, prepare to do like 3 crisis interventions at the table. So we always like to have 2 people there so somebody can, navigate handing out swag and like the fun conversations of like, yeah, we're here. And then people coming up and disclosing. We also have people who just like don't make eye contact with us, which is great, where they see our, North Coast Rape Crisis team and they look at their table and they're like, not here.
Yeah, I'm going to go the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And just steer clear.
Yeah, or like they don't like their kids near our table, and I'm like, we have bubbles, we have coloring pages. They're like, no.
Yeah, it's kind of nice that you guys can tag team that. So, okay, I'm going to handle this one. You do the education, then we'll swap. Everything's going to be copacetic. It's the parenting thing worries me in some regards, because the idea that you would go tell your parent that this happened to you, and then for whatever reason, maybe there's the inclination to diminish it or kind of brush it aside, which is an understandable thing. Because if you're a parent and your kid comes and says, hey, something not that great happened, especially if it's a family member or somebody that obviously is close to the child, to acknowledge that and figure out a way to move through it would be crippling. Obviously for the child, but for the parent as well, knowing that you were the guardian of this person and this is your kid. This is your flesh and blood. This is your child. And this thing happened right under your nose. And now if you acknowledge that, you almost have to take on some of the guilt of something went wrong.
Kid.
Yeah. Which you didn't really, but
no. But guilt,
that's how you would feel.
Yeah.
I mean, if, I don't have kids, but that would be crippling to me if that came to light or something like that happened.
Yeah. It's hard. Like, that guilt eats you alive. And so I think for a lot of times, especially for parents, it's that like that culpability of I let my kid down. So if I don't address this, it didn't happen, maybe, or especially when harm happens to really young kids, like 3 and under, there's also this preconceived notion that they won't remember what happened to them, so it's not going to affect them. or if we don't talk about it, they're not going to remember. But like our bodies hold memories. So they might not have, you know, the visual memory, but there's also that, you know, that harm still manifests throughout somebody's life. That trauma still is being carried. And so there's also, we see that especially with like really young kids where they're like, well, thankfully they're not going to remember this. And we're like, it might play out
The
differently
odds aren't that
later.
great that it's
Yeah.
not. Yeah.
Might manifest in a different way, but
Yeah. Like, sorry to break that bubble, but
The don't talk about it thing is insane.
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean,
I was gonna note too, like a little off topic, but also like when those people are going to their parents, a lot of times there is that culture of like blaming or like, oh, why were you there? Why were you out drinking? Like, what were you wearing? That type of thing. And so, as far as those barriers, like we were talking about earlier, to reporting is like, if the first person you tell is like questioning you about these things that really don't matter, because we know 100% of the responsibility is on that person choosing to do harm. It's like, I don't know, the parents, we do, our services are available to parents too, and so we do like do some like light, like, hey, this might be a better way to say this, or this is more like trauma informed ways to speak or whatever. So I think that can be a really big challenge too. Yeah.
Which is hard because a lot of these parents, especially of teens, the initial kind of gut like, well, why did you go there? You didn't tell me you were going there. It's
Yeah.
not from that place of like victim blaming. So you talk to them and they're like,
Right.
they're connecting them with us, they're wanting them to get into counseling, all these other things. But that first response was of, panic. So you ask those questions. It's kind of like second nature. Like, where were you? What were you doing? How did this happen?
Yeah.
And it's coming from a place of, fear.
Right.
I couldn't protect you. Where were you? Where were you at? What were you doing? But it also comes off especially victim blaming for somebody who has just went through a traumatic event and they're already afraid to tell their parents, especially those who are like out at a party or, snuck out of their house. And so they're like, well, if I tell my parents, I'm going to get in trouble. And that's also a big like navigation we do, especially with teens of, and with parents, because the parents will be like, well, she's grounded and her phone's taken away because she snuck out of my house and stole my alcohol, and that's not allowed. And then this assault happened.
Yeah, I love how you named it. It doesn't always come from like a bad place. Like they're trying to do their best, but
Yeah. But that gut reaction of like, where were you? What were you doing? That's inevitable. I still hold those, like, my niece goes off and does something or those kinds of things. She gets hurt. I'm like, well, where were you? What were you doing? And she was like, I was just down the street on my scooter. And I'm like, okay. So
Is
like,
that is that a challenge walking the line of victim blaming? Because in some regards, you do want parents to teach their kids, hey, don't, especially young daughters, I would imagine you would want to teach them, hey, don't walk by yourself late at night. And there's this weird, or not necessarily weird, but there's this dichotomy of people who think in teaching your kids that is problematic, that we shouldn't live in a society like that. We shouldn't have to prime our kids to be cautious. But then there's the other side of, well, that's the society we live in, for better or worse right now in this point in time. That's the reality of our world. And so we should teach our kids to be careful and be cautious and look out for these warning signs, because there's a reason that if you end up in one of those situations, something might happen.
Yeah.
And that obviously after the fact is victim blaming, but before it's precautionary. And is that a challenge trying to walk that so it's not victim blaming, or is it all situational depending on if it happened before or if it happened after?
Yeah. So we do 1 to 2 week like rape prevention education programs in high schools, primarily like freshman seminar classes, like health classes. And we talk about like risk management. So like risk versus responsibility, because there is risky behavior that can elevate, violence, or like elevate the opportunity for violence. So if somebody's, out walking at night by themselves, those kinds of things, like where's your risk at? And so then navigating the tools of like when we're out doing risky behavior or when there's risks present, how to, keep a mindful eye on things. So like if you're out at a party with your friends, how can we kind of navigate safety within that? Because you get to go out with your friends. You get to go out to parties. You get to, live your life and sneak out of your house and be 16. Like you get to live your life. And within living your life, there's risk. And there are things that can elevate that risk or can elevate the opportunity for harm. But without those monopolizing on those vulnerabilities, there wouldn't be that harm. But that harm exists, and that harm's going to continue to exist. So how can we navigate these risks safely? So we talk about having a buddy system, bringing your own drinks, just really like safe partying tips, safe navigations, knowing where you're going, keeping, if you're going to go for a walk late at night, maybe not listen with noise canceling headphones and like wearing all black or, those kinds of things. So like navigating how to live your life with these risks as safe as we can and as proactive as we can. So like having those safety measures for ourselves. Like I, like many young 20-year-olds, I was on like dating apps and different things like that. And so I had friends who had my location. I would tell people where I was going via like the address and send a photo of the person I was meeting up with, and those are just, I was doing risky behavior, not gonna lie that. But I was doing proactive safety tips around it. So if anything happened, there's this kind of like safety net. So we try to navigate like having a safety net because you get to be risky. It's part of the fun.
Well, that's the crazy thing is most kids are going to engage in risky behavior. I think we can all all acknowledge that sitting here. That's just part of growing up. Fortunately or unfortunately, you do these things and then you learn from them. Hopefully it ends well and you have these experiences and most of them are positive, and then you grow up and kind of course alters and you've learned these things. But looking back, at least speaking for myself, looking back, it's almost absurd that some of the situations I have been in and made it through, because you put yourself in risky situations and looking back, you have the hindsight to say, wow,
that was risky.
Probably shouldn't have been there. Yeah, that was not the best call. But not everybody makes it through. That's the crazy part.
Yeah. You could have, you go to a party, there's 20 people there, and one person experiences harm. The other 18 people are unscathed.
Right.
I'm not counting the person who, created the harm. But the other 18 people, they're living their life as a normal Friday.
No problems.
No problems.
They made it through.
Yeah. So, and there's never, there's not like you open the door one day to go out and you're like, tonight's the night. There's never.
Probably stay home tonight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You probably wouldn't go out if you knew that, if there was a note delivered on your doorstep saying, if you go to this party tonight, bad XYZ is going to happen, you most likely would not go.
Yeah. And it can be hard for survivors to really feel like not having guilt or feeling like it was their fault in any way when we know that it's not their fault in any way, even if they were doing, risky things. But that is something that some people have a hard time understanding. Like, hey, it's still not your fault.
Well, the randomness of it all is, I think, what would understandably trip people up. Because especially if you go to the same party with a group of friends and it happened to you and it didn't happen to your friends, well, what
are the
why?
odds?
Yeah, why? I would be. Yeah, why am I the one?
Yeah, really confusing. And we know that it, like, more often than not, is in people's own homes or someone's house they know. So feeling like that's a safe space too can be really throw someone off.
That's terrifying. The fact that a lot of it is perpetrated by people that are close to you or family members is terrifying.
Yep.
I don't know if it would be better or worse if there were just a bunch of random people perpetrating this. I don't know if that would be.
Right. Yeah.
Because then you have the scary thought of, oh man, anyone is dangerous.
But people feel that anyway.
Yeah.
People feel that anyway. It's always that like stranger in the bush. When reality, I think it's like 85% of assaults happen from somebody that you know.
Yeah.
So like a close friend, somebody like a friend of a friend, or
at
a casual
least an acquaintance, like majority of the time. Yeah.
Somebody in your vicinity.
Yeah. And especially for minors.
Yeah.
It's almost always somebody that they know or has access to them, like a family friend, coach, friend's older brother, cousin. That's hard.
That's terrifying.
Well,
it's terrifying,
it's terrifying,
really.
Yeah. And then like thinking of, I'm not a parent, but thinking of like as a parent, the people who you allow close to your kid are people that you trust, right? If you're going to have somebody babysit or watch your kid, you're going to trust them. And so that extra layer of betrayal and guilt for that parent of like, I let my kid, be watched by this person or around this person or stay the night at this person's house or.
Well, I think that plays into why someone might be more inclined to diminish what happened, not
Mhm.
even intentionally or
Mhm.
consciously, but just through their actions, is because of that dynamic
Yeah.
of, well, it was somebody that I trusted, so how, especially if it's a family member. I mean,
Mhm.
that's a whole other can of worms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, having like new nieces and nephews in my family, and then recently like knowing more of the statistics about this is I'm really like, whoa, like okay, I don't have kids, but I'm gotta look out for these other kids because I
Mhm.
know what happens.
See, how do you balance that? How do you become so overcorrected where now everybody is this
On watch.
potential enemy, yeah, or potential bad
Yeah.
actor in
I
all of
mean,
this?
right, it's
Mhm.
good like knowledge is power, right? Like knowing things is important. But me like just speaking for myself, I am very good at like unplugging when I get home from work and not thinking about work. Like I want to do other stuff like but
Mhm.
I know that it's easy to get stuck in like having that on your mind all the time and really like having a hard time separating those things. But at least for me, now I'm really good at separating those, and that's very important.
Yeah. And I think like my niece is 3 years old, so she's really young, and just having the conversations of one, what is consent? Because it's not just in the sexual purview; it's also like, well, did you let this person play with your toy, or like, those kinds of things. So like having the ongoing conversation of like what's okay for you and what's not okay, and that we don't hold secrets, and like what is a secret, and like those kinds of conversations too, of just like navigating if there is harm, somebody feeling safe to one communicate that, being open to hearing it, and also like naming like, oh, I believe you in this, or those kinds of things. And I also, she knows the names of her private parts. She knows the names of what a vagina is. She
At three
knows.
years old.
Mhm. You have those conversations because when you go to the doctor and you get checked out, they're looking at your vagina or different things like that. That's a language that adults use. And so if somebody else comes in and calls it something else, and she says, I went and they, tickled my poo or whatever it is, those kinds of things. If she said that to me, I wouldn't know what that means. And so her having the name, I mean, she doesn't say it, I gotta go pee, or, she uses other verbiage on a day to day, but she knows what they are. And she knows that her brother has a penis. And she knows that they both have butts and like those kinds of things. So, I mean, it's not that like serious anatomy talk at that age, but they know what these names are and how it like with other adults and those kinds of things, and what a safe touch is and what an unsafe touch is. She is obsessed with baby dolls, so she knows all about diapers. She loves her little cousin. And so that's the other thing of like, oh, she peed in her diaper. I need to like wipe her vagina, make sure it's all clean. Those kinds of conversations are happening of the normalization of it all. So if somebody else came in outside of our family or someone within our family said or did anything to like say otherwise, because he's even said at school, like, well, this person calls it this or different things like that. And she's like, I told them those are called boobies and not a chest, or like those kinds of things. So, I mean, she's using it in like the day to day, but like Makhi said, knowledge is power. And so having that verbiage and knowing what that anatomy is and knowing what a safe touch is and what an unsafe touch is and how you feel when somebody gives you a touch. I also never expect a hug from her. And I let her know, if you don't want to give somebody a hug, if you don't want to give somebody a kiss, you don't have to. And you can still love that person and you can still like that person, but you don't have to show that person physical affection, because that's also very, that's something that's placed on kids a lot of the time. And so that also blurs body boundaries. So if somebody doesn't feel safe with somebody, or somebody causes harm, and it's the obligation that we have to give physical touch to adults, that also is like a way to kind of navigate harm.
A dangerous social primer in
Yeah,
some
it
regard.
is. I mean, I remember as a little kid going to family events and being like, you have to give
Yeah,
every
yeah,
aunt, uncle, and who was it, like a hug and a kiss on the
yeah.
cheek. It was an obligation. It wasn't a choice. And so letting her know that she has a choice, that she doesn't have to give anybody, the time of day if she doesn't want to, or a physical touch. It's empowering as a young person to know that you have choices.
Do you guys buy into the argument that in teaching kids these things and in holding these things in schools, especially as you go down the chain from high school to middle school and
Mhm.
younger, that in some regard we're almost priming kids to be sexual, or do you think this is a necessary evolution of where we are in society that we have to teach kids this because of the circumstances going on, or is it like a
Mhm.
chicken or the egg situation? I mean, because
So,
the sexually
mhm,
priming kids is a huge, like you could say, cultural argument today in a ton
mhm,
of different regards.
Yeah,
yeah.
like the media, for example,
Yeah.
like definitely young people are over sexualized, like in things that we see, like certain like movies or just like ad campaigns
Everyday
for
life.
clothing or
Yeah.
yeah, just everything, right? Yeah. But
Mhm. I
you're
was gonna
gonna
say, especially for like young kids and like through media, they're already ingesting that and viewing that. When I first started doing prevention work, I went into preschools and middle, and I went through. We had a pre-K through fourth grade program where we talked about like the main premise was like no go tell. You get to say no from somebody, you get to go away from anyone who makes you feel unsafe, and you get to tell a trusted adult. And in that program, we talked about the names of our body parts and our private parts. And the hard thing is that these kids are already being primed for abuse. Abuse has been happening for years. I think creating a space to talk about this harm and letting people know that it's okay to talk about, I think that's kind of where the shift is happening because the harm has been happening and it's continued to happen. That those numbers aren't changing that we're seeing, but being able to have the conversation about it, you know, that opens the door. Because for a lot of families don't talk about it. In the classroom, usually you don't talk about it. And so if somebody's coming in and talking about harm, and it might not be directly what you experienced, but you're like, that made me feel unsafe. Because what is unsafe making me feel like? I feel anxious. I feel antsy. That doesn't feel like that wasn't a safe secret. It might connect in with a kid who outside of our program or another program coming in wouldn't have the opportunity to talk about it because the harm may have already happened, but they were maybe shut down at the family level or they didn't feel safe to talk to a safe adult or that harm is happening from a caregiver. And so coming in and breaking kind of that third wall of, this harm does happen to kids. And I think it also makes children a lot more empathetic thinking about the harm that might happen to somebody else, even if they haven't experienced that. Because I mean, after COVID coming into a freshman classroom, those kids didn't the social norms were completely stripped. And so there were jokes being made. It felt like I was walking to a classroom in 2007. It literally felt like I was like, is this 2021 right now? Um, I was like, this feels like when I was in middle school. The the slander that was being said, the victim blaming statements that were being said, and so reconstructing back into consent culture, talking about consent, talking about this harm because the harm's happening. The harm is being ingested and blowing up somebody's phone. We talk about coercion. When somebody says no the first time and you blow up their phone and texting them over and over and over again until they feel like they can't say no and they send you a photo, or you tell somebody, if you don't send me a photo, I'm going to tell your parents, that you snuck out the other night, blackmailing somebody, forms of abuse, blocking somebody from leaving a space is false imprisonment. For some kids, that's so crazy to think because, like, if you're in a car in an argument with your partner and they lock the door and they say, you're not leaving until this conversation is done, whether you're done with the conversation or not, that's abuse. And so you can see kind of these, the wheels turning because the teens are learning from teens. And so if your friend is going through something similar and you're looking for them for advice, they're like, that's normal. That just means he loves you. And we're like, no.
Red flag.
Yeah, red flag. No. And so like it's kind of breaking down that one, bringing up self-love. What is our worth? What do we want in a relationship? What are green flags? What do we like to see? What do you want in a relationship? Good humor, great communication, freedom to go hang out with your friends, and reaffirming those kinds of ideals that, this person deserves to have a life outside of their relationship. And so there'll be literal, couples in our classes and they're like sitting on each other's laps in a class. And I'm like, separation's an okay thing. You don't have to be connected at the hip, And we talk about boundaries and how if one person has power in this relationship, how that can manifest into different harm and how it slowly trickles into harm and how it's, the harm that's shown in movies is also dramatized. They don't talk about like the slow build of first it's, controlling who you're texting or who you're hanging out with or hanging out outside, waiting for you to get done with practice, not having time to separate. And then it, manifests into different harm. And then maybe it's verbal abuse. Maybe then, that emotional hold, maybe you're isolated. Maybe, every time you go and hang out with your friend and your friends are noticing a difference in you. And so they're saying, I don't like, since you've been dating him, like you don't hang out with us anymore. I notice a change in you. And you go back and tell your partner that. And they're like, well, these people aren't your friends. Like, don't you love me? Don't you want to hang out with me? Like, if your friends loved you, they'd want to see you happy. Don't I make you happy?
The manipulation aspect of it gets dicey. And sometimes it can be a really gray area.
Mhm.
I mean, I dated this girl one time and she loved to fight, but she fought in a very toxic way where she would want you to almost block the door and like stay there and like do this
Mhm.
big grandiose exaggeration of I'm fighting
Yeah.
for you, and she would
Mhm.
storm off and want you to chase after her, and that shit is exhausting. Trying
Yeah.
to first off fill that role, but then realizing, oh, this is a ridiculous way to work through a problem. Like, what is happening? We're just running into the wall, but that's kind of what you want, is that whole play of,
Mhm.
oh, do this thing and
Fight for
fight.
me.
Yeah.
Fight for
And it's
me.
how incredibly toxic is that to go through?
Yeah. Well, and also thinking if that's not your way of having an argument, like
Well, it
if you
shouldn't
don't
be
want
anybody's way.
exactly,
That's not the
shouldn't be
ideal way
any
to have an argument.
at
That's
all.
like textbook 101. If this is happening,
Happening.
there's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's like we talk about like mutual toxicity because some people they feed off of each other. They might love each other so hard one day and then the next day it's like they fight tooth and nail and that's how they like their relationship. And so like we're sitting there and I'm like 2 16-year-olds like you guys shouldn't be fighting like this. No one should be fighting like this. Like it's such a hard way also to like break it down to them of like this isn't right. You creating or like you working up this situation to the point of like it's a like a verbal altercation. So like we also change like the language of like that's a fight, that's an altercation, like that's abuse. Nobody should be yelled at in an argument. I mean, I understand like raising your voice or different things like that, but if you're full blown like spit flying in each other's faces, like maybe that's a time to take a break. And how can before it gets to that point, take a break before then, and like do you feel like you can communicate? Because for a lot of people, it's like, I don't feel like I'm listened to until it's at that point. Like I have to be at my breaking point to be heard, which then it's breaking down like healthy communication. How do you communicate with people? It's just all of these. It's also like if you grew up in a toxic household, if that's what you saw.
Then that's what you emulate. I mean, how do you
Mhm.
know what a healthy relationship is if you've never seen one in your life?
This is how my parents duke it out. So
This must be love. This is
Yeah.
what love looks like. It's people screaming at each other and storming
Mhm.
out and slamming doors. This is love. So in
Mhm.
order to feel like you love me, I need to start experiencing some of that.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, how do you pull yourself out of that rabbit hole? I mean,
Yeah.
in some ways, it's almost like you have to go through that to recognize it, but nobody wants to go through that. Nobody wants anybody they love to go through that. I mean, it's
hard. I mean, I've been doing this work since I was 19. So I saw a lot of my friends and myself go through like toxic relationships, even holding all of this information and doing this work. I've been in toxic relationships. I've been in domestic violence relationships, doing this work, actively going out on a scene and talking to somebody and then walking away and being like, "Oh, this is what's happening to me."
not great.
Not great. Not a good feeling to sit in. Like going into a classroom and talking about abuse and then like walking away and being like, maybe I'm going through that.
Yeah, having that light bulb moment. Oh, maybe
Oh.
some of this applies to me right now. Can that be?
Yeah, and so it's so easy to get wrapped up, especially in like domestic violence relationships or like infant partner violence. It feels like a trickle effect. It's so easy to get swept up in that love, and especially when you're like 16. And it's so hard to see, like, as somebody on the outside, even like with your friends on the outside being like, this is a toxic relationship, but I want to support my friend. And if I tell my friend straight out, like, you need to leave this relationship, this isn't good, she might never talk to me again until she's, out of this relationship or something really bad happens. I've had to cut friends off because they're in toxic relationships, in abusive relationships. And, they would call me in the middle of the night and be like, can you come and pick me up? And I'd come and pick them up, and they would stay at my house, and we'd problem solve. And then 3 days later, back at it again.
Nothing changes.
Nothing changes. And so I literally had to set that boundary, because if they knew that they could access me and get out of that situation, no matter what fight took place, and they left, they were going to come back, because they knew that I was going to be there in case something bad happened again. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, because I knew that person was still experiencing harm. I knew that relationship, surprisingly, was not going to get better after the 15th time. And I had to sit there and say, I can't do this. I can't watch you hurt yourself like this. This person's hurting you, but like, you have an opportunity to not go back in that space. And I can't watch you do that again. I can't. And eventually she got out of that relationship, and now she has a really great, happy life with like 3 kids and is like doing all these great things. I'm super proud of her. But it took like her figuring that out for herself. And she thanked me later, because I thought I was making one of like the biggest mistakes of my life. And she thanked me like 2 years later, saying like, thank you for doing that, because like her mom already shut that door on her. Other people in her life already shut that door on her. And I was just, like in that place of like, this person needs a space. Like, I'm going to do that. But, her partner broke like the taillight on my car, all of these other things. Like, the abuse bled into our friendship, our lives. He threatened me. He came to my house, and I'm like, at what point is this going to
enough?
Yeah. Is this going to cross the line for you? Because my line's being crossed. My line is being crossed and then jumped back over multiple times. So it takes until like reaching that point for themselves as well, that they're worth leaving that relationship. Because on average, with domestic violence relationships, it takes upwards of 7 times leaving for that person to actually like leave that relationship, which is so hard to think about. And I mean, if she had kids with this person, if they owned a home together, all of those other factors, what would that have looked like? Because if she would have gotten pregnant with this person, I guarantee she'd probably still be with him.
Well, how many people get wrapped up in that? They just they get into this not great relationship and then have a kid, and that's now your life.
Yeah.
You are now in this relationship.
Yeah, whether you're with that person trying to make it work, trying to make a family, or having to co-parent with an extremely toxic, abusive person for 18 years.
Yeah.
Or the rest of your life.
Yeah, rest of your life,
Yeah.
really. And I'm a firm believer that people can't see that until they're ready to see it. Because I think everybody's been there where you're either in it yourself or you have a friend and it just doesn't click.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you're saying, whatever they're saying to you, it's just not passing through that barrier. And then like your friend a couple years later, maybe you finally wake up, but it doesn't happen through people telling you, hey, this is a problem, which is insane. Because if it was anything else, if you were driving a car and you kept crashing it, you would be able to recognize, oh,
maybe you shouldn't drive.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't drive, or maybe I need to readdress how I'm driving or relearn how to drive. But with relationships, you can just keep hitting that wall and go right back to it and say, nope, this time. And there's
the
that
promise of change.
that weird disconnect where you can just put on blinders and say, this is going to be the time. It's going to work. Yeah, there are these red flags, but the highs are so high that it's worth it.
And within those really abusive relationships, like you brought up earlier, trauma bonding is a real thing. And when you're in that, you hold on to those like little, like maybe it's like someone is like love bombs you, and then it's abusive, and then you hold on to like the small amount of good things or whatever. But yeah,
you're just grasping at straws.
Yeah.
Literally. Yeah.
But your brain is really like, trauma. It's bonding to this other person because it's so abusive, and obviously that's not every situation. Like,
but even
it can
if
be
it's
toxic
not,
without that.
yeah, even if it's not abusive, the trauma bonding, and then you stack on the isolation aspect where, you need to stop talking to these people, and then it's pretty soon it's just you two.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then who do you go to?
Right.
Because your friends, maybe they've been cut off because your partner didn't like them, or maybe they, like you said, hey, I I can't sit by and watch you get hurt. And
Yeah.
then it's just you
Yeah.
two, and it almost builds the system
They're
of, well, now we
everything.
have to be
They're
together.
everything for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, you're all I have
Mhm.
left.
Yep.
So now I guess we're just going to find a way, or just go at this together, burn it together, go down in
Mhm.
flames.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody understands us.
They just don't
We
get
love
it.
too hard. That one, like, it's domestic violence is so intricate. And I mean, we connect with survivors on like the sexualized violence end, which is usually always interconnected as like a power and control tool within that. But when people usually come forward regarding domestic violence, that's one of the last things that they disclose is the sexualized violence
Mhm.
because it's so intimate. And there's also the stigma of that it is an obligation when you're in a relationship to be intimate with somebody. And so sexual assault doesn't exist when you're married to somebody or you're in a relationship, which is completely untrue. But that's what a lot of people are told by their partner, where you're my girlfriend, you have to do this. And then it's also just rebuilding basic needs. When somebody leaves a relationship like that, it's rebuilding, their own trust in themselves. This person's so broken down where they can't trust their decisions. And so making that decisions for themselves, figuring out, if they live together, housing, all of these other kind of like basic fundamental needs. And then it's that like emotional healing is coming up like second, which is hard.
Not to switch gears here,
Mhm.
but I was listening to you talk about that and listening to our whole conversation. I would make the uninformed claim that probably most of the people coming to you guys are women. Do you think that's true? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's another crazy dynamic in all of this, right? Is that the stigma and just the reality of if you're a guy and this has happened to you, especially if it's another guy that perpetrated it
Mhm.
onto you. Would you just carry that shit to the ground? Like, how does that pan out?
Yeah,
How do
so-
you get through to those guys?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
harm does happen to everybody. Sexual violence happens to every person. Like or not every person, but like every gender, whatever, ethnicity, sexual orientation, everybody. Like in those groups, like there are people who experience that harm, and like as far as like barriers, I think there is even more of a stigma of like male identifying people not coming forward to talk about because all of those things we already discussed, like that guys always want it, or like if it is another guy, like, oh, you're just like this is your sexual orientation now, or yeah.
Well, what if you're a straight guy and this happens to you? I mean, how
Right.
do you
Yeah.
work through that?
That's a lot of barriers, right? There's a stigma around male identified survivors. One, because there's a stigma that all males are perpetrators. And so when somebody experiences harm, especially in a movement that doesn't support male survivors, they're less likely to come forward. That's just a reality. When we talk about like gender stereotypes and like the norms around like masculine behavior, that like guys always want to have sex, that they can't be perceived to be weak, or if they're assaulted by somebody of the same gender identity. So if it's like male on male, that stigma of like homophobia. If I come forward, is people going to believe me, or are they going to say that I'm gay, or all of these kind of other things that the same barriers apply for like when somebody who is female identifying comes forward. Those same barriers are also on males plus more. And so it also doesn't help that majority of the time that men experience sexual assault is usually child sexual abuse. And it's also usually from somebody that they love and somebody who has access to them, and it's usually male. And so there's also those kind of like all of these dynamics that are at play. And, same being said, when a female makes a report to law enforcement, the ask is usually they don't want a male identified officer. And so for a male going to make a report and it's another male officer looking at them, they're feeling that kind of like shame, that guilt, that, uncomfortability, that embarrassment. And is the amount of reports that are mailed from male survivors are so low because of these stigmas. It's not that the harm's not happening. It's happening at a lesser rate than female identified folks, but that's also not, putting into fact like the LGBT QIA2S plus community. There is this minority where harm happens at an elevated level, not just from those who are in that community, but also from straight people doing assaults on people who are not in the same, you know, the elevation of harm is so much higher, but the reporting is so much lower and the access to services is so much lower because of stigma.
Well, and you have that double-edged sword, like you said, where if you're a guy and it's a guy that perpetrated it, you have that set of stigma of, oh, are you gay now? Like, what?
Mhm.
And then if it's a girl that perpetrated it, you have, oh, some girl wanted to have sex with you.
Yeah,
Okay,
you got
big deal.
some, why are
Yeah,
you
big deal.
complaining?
What?
Right.
You got laid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or especially if it's like a female on male. Well, couldn't you overpower her? Couldn't you fight her off? Or even same if it's a male on male. Well, didn't you fight? Like, you know, especially if somebody's like, well, you're like 6 foot, you know, like you could totally like pound some, like you could beat somebody up. Like, why didn't you do that? So also really isolating in the sense of like if you have a trauma response in that situation, because if it's somebody that you know, let's say it's a casual acquaintance and they're female and you don't, you know, want to be intimate and that person, you know, forces you, that's sexual assault. You might not, I don't know, deck that person in the face. That might not be your first response of like, get off of me. It's the same as if anybody experiences an assault. You could freeze. You could, you know, there are so many other elements that come regarding trauma that it's so hard to like place that blame on somebody of like, well, why didn't you fight back? Or you could overpower this person. Like this person was still afraid. This person's still processing what's going on. For a lot of times, especially with like sexual assault, the reaction time is so like slow because you're kind of just processing like, the hell's happening?
Yeah, what's going on
What's
right
going
now?
on right now? Is this really happening? Because again, it's usually somebody that you know. So you're like, is this person really doing this right now? And it's the same for male identified people than it is for females.
I
So
don't
it's
remember
like,
the exact statistic, but a really high percentage of people who experience like rape experience tonic immobility, where literally their survival instinct, like their biological reaction, is they
freeze.
can't move.
Is that just because it's so traumatic?
It's the same as like if you experience like a car crash, like that same like it's trauma, and so you know you see it with like people like in active combat. So it is that trauma, and then it's also like our mind trying to protect ourselves. Like our minds are super like ingrained in trying to protect
Other animals too, we see
Mhm.
that. There's videos of like other like I don't know, it was like I don't know what kind of animals it was that I
Possums.
saw. But
Just
yeah,
freeze it.
yeah. There's an
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, so that's like that's a trauma response. It's also we hear from a lot of people too who do like say like self-defense or like self-defense measures that like you can have these tools in your toolkit, but if something happens and there's harm happening, our like lizard brain, for like lack of a better
Right.
like word, like it comes into play. Like our primal instincts are the ones that come forward.
Survival mode.
Well,
Mhm.
fight or flight, right?
Yep. And so when we talk a lot, because one of the things, especially with like victim blaming, is like, why didn't you fight back? Or like, why didn't you yell? Why didn't you kick, scream, or those kinds of things? And like somebody could be like that tonic immobility, so overcome with fear that their mind shuts down. Like
Mhm.
they're mentally present, but they're not there. So like dissociation comes into play,
Yeah.
and it also might not be safe for that person to fight back.
Yeah.
If somebody tried to assault me and they were, let's say, like 6'5" and jacked, am I going to win that fight? No, because that person would potentially take my life or
And
harm me worse.
yeah, and it's an
Yeah.
uncontrollable thing that happens. So, like Kira was talking about, how we kind of like say that to some, or like when somebody is feeling guilt for like not fighting back,
Mhm.
what
You-
we tell them, which is true, is like your body did what it could to keep you alive.
Yeah. You did everything you could in that moment to survive.
Yeah.
You're here talking to us today and we're able to have a conversation. You were able to survive that situation, regardless if you physically protected yourself in that capacity.
Mhm.
Survival. Because if, let's say, you fight back, that elevation of harm can make you way higher. You know, if this person has a gun, a knife, or whatever, but your elevation, like you did whatever you could in that moment to survive, and we want to like enhance that of like you did protect yourself.
Mhm.
You're here.
Yep.
You know, it might not feel like, I didn't lay a punch, that kind of thing, but you did protect yourself. Whatever you'd had to do mentally
Mhm.
to protect yourself. So like even if sometimes like people, a lot of times people dissociate during an assault.
That's the biggest one, right? You hear that a lot.
Yeah, people compartmentalize where they're literally seeing this assault from a view like over themselves. That's survival.
Mm-hmm.
Your mind literally said, you cannot be here right now. So you survived. That's as simple. You survived. It doesn't feel good a lot of the times. There's always these what ifs. That's part of the victim blame culture, all of those things. But survival looks different for so many people. And that's why trauma responses are so different for everybody. Because if somebody's experienced assault maybe multiple times in their lifetime, and then they experience another assault, somebody might be, might have a different trauma response. Maybe the first time they fought back and they were beaten. And so the second time they experience an assault, they're going along with it because they don't want to be beaten, even if it's a different perpetrator.
Yeah. And I think that kind of highlights the importance of talking more about like, teaching people not to do these things instead of like, oh, self-defense, carry this pepper spray. And like, oh, of course, like all those things aren't bad things to do, right? It can like prevent things, right? But the real important thing is like preventing someone from deciding to do this, to cause this harm.
I'll be honest, I've never really been a fan of that side of the argument. I understand, one of the things I've always heard is that we need to raise boys to be better men. And that kind of irks me in some ways. I understand where they're coming from when they say that. Part of me feels like they're just diminishing the female perpetrator side. Part of me is upset because it's not good men that are perpetrating these things. Like, it's not people that are being raised up right that are doing this. It's not an educational thing. People know that rape is wrong. So it's not we need to raise better men. We have better men. It's that bad people do bad things. And so the idea that we're just going to, through education or through these institutions, just going to raise a new generation of men that are just above this is kind of absurd in some regard, because we have good men that don't do this and we have bad people that do bad things. Like, that's just a reality of where we are in society. I think a better stance would be, I will raise my daughter. I mean, I hope she'll do MMA. I hope she'll be in these classes. I think every girl should carry a gun, be protective, or at least carry pepper spray. I mean, it's unfortunate. It goes back to that thing where it's unfortunate that we are in a society where we might have to take these precautions, but we are also in a society where you have to take these precautions. So rather than hope the world just becomes a better place, yes, we can work towards that. But rather than just hope that happens, maybe we do take these steps. Maybe we train girls to fight so that they can protect themselves and they feel more confident. Maybe we should definitely train men to fight too, because if you're a guy and you can carry yourself, maybe you're more inclined to intervene. Maybe you work through some things that might have led you down a path where you become a bully because you have these repressed things. I don't know, but
Yeah,
we should be preventative.
I don't think like one is bad and the others. I think like both can be useful things, right? Like more education, better, right?
Yeah.
And then like also, if you're doing these things to protect yourself, that's also something that could be useful.
I just have a problem with that idea, going on a rant there for a little bit, but I have a problem with the idea that it's just going to be solved by raising better men. I think again, I get the sentiment. I just think the message there is a little misplaced. I don't think that's how we solve this problem. If we can solve it at all, I don't know if we ever get to a point where something like this doesn't happen.
Yeah. I think I understand where you're coming from, of that sense, especially of like, we just need to raise better boys, because there are amazing men who would never lay a hand on a person. There are amazing people who are raising kids, with consent culture and like all of these other elements. And I think self-protection and, all of these other things are really important for people. Like we teach self-defense. We do workshops around self-defense. So I'm a self-defense instructor, and, having these toolkits in your tool belt are so important. And you could train every single day and have, your concealed to carry and all these. You can have these personal protections, and your brain still might freeze.
Yep.
It's just, it's also like, I don't want to put the blame on anybody who, if their whole life is a surface of, I can take care of myself. And in that one moment where that harm was happening, everything switched. And so then holding that guilt, shame around like, I know how to fight. I know how to protect myself, and I couldn't in that moment. And then also on like the flip side, majority of the, people who are perpetrated are male identifying. And that's not to then negate, like, females are perpetrators, non-binary people are perpetrators. Anybody can be a perpetrator the same way anybody can experience exploitation. I think the conversations are also really hard because, like you named, there are really great people who would never do that, and they're going to raise their kids to treat people with respect. And there are people who perpetrate violence who are going to raise their kids in a different way. And that doesn't mean that those kids are then going to perpetrate violence. There are households where that's never been talked about, where that harm hasn't happened to them, and that person still might perpetrate violence, because a lot of times violence is an opportunity. And so I think starting the conversation around education as a prevention and not an intervention, because for a long time all of the services around sexualized violence were intervention services, so when harm already happened. So coming in as a preventative measure and talking about like what sexualized violence is, what for how harm manifests, it can give a warning sign for somebody who, one, might be doing that behavior and not realizing that it's hurtful, because we don't know what happens inside households. We don't know what, happens inside somebody's own psyche, because it's also very personal. Somebody might experience harm. That doesn't mean that person's going to, perpetrate harm. It's very secular for somebody. And so if we can come in and talk about what harm looks like as a whole and not calling out, that's the one thing that, like, when we go into classrooms, if somebody says a question where we're like, or whatever, or like it's hurtful in some way, we answer that question. And we say, like, well, maybe looking at it from this perspective, or, those kinds of things. So we never want to shut somebody down, because that might be an opportunity to change their perspective on something. So if somebody has like this feeling of, that they've maybe have perpetrated harm, and they're like, well, that's not harm. And so we can give it to them in like a different perspective of, you can force somebody to give you oral copulation. That's like a big one. Like, how can you force somebody to give you a blowjob? I'm like, well, you can. And these are maybe potentially ways how, but not like explicitly, but, like naming all of these different control dynamics, it might change the way that they view the behavior that they're already doing. So it might change the narrative for themselves, because they may not realize that that's abuse or that's harm,
Yeah.
because it's not modeled to them.
Yeah.
So I can see it on both ends. As somebody who did intervention services for like 6 years, like straight on just intervention services, compared to the prevention, you can see the wheels working in some, like, especially in like high school and like middle school, because sometimes this is the first time these kids are having a conversation around what these things are. And it opens the opportunity to reflect on behaviors that they might already be having, and also for the future, recognizing when toxic behaviors are there. So it is a safety measure, because if you don't know what consent looks like, and you don't know when consent isn't present, and you get into a situation and maybe you're like, I didn't feel good about that, but you don't have that knowledge to kind of fall back on, it can feel really isolating. And if we're, talking to your friend and they experiencing something similar and they're like, well, that's normal, you can kind of step out of that and be like, well, that's not normal. Or, this made me feel this way, and oh, that's a sexual assault, or whatever that is, or that person overcrossed my boundary and I didn't like it. And so it gives kids the opportunity to learn and grow from the base level, whether they've already experienced harm or they've already caused harm. It's a reflection. And I think that's really important, to reflect on behavior, because we can always grow and we can always learn. And if we just don't talk about it, it's going to happen anyway.
And I think talking about it, kind of like, I don't know how to say it. Like, it's something in the past that's been normalized and not talked about. And if we talk about it more, I think it makes people who are more prone to cause harm less comfortable to do that, if everyone's talking about it.
Yeah, all of that said, not to discredit the effectiveness of prevention and these intervention methods. I think where I'm coming from when I'm talking about that counterpoint is the idea of your stereotypical rape, of holding somebody down and forcing yourself on them. I don't believe the idea that, first off, the people that you were saying we need to raise better men, I think the people that are hearing that message and going to be receptive to that message are already the people that are doing that. Yeah, so it's like you're speaking to everybody who already is aligned with this. I think someone who has a kid who is raised the opposite way, or somebody who themselves doesn't think that rape is bad, you're not
Mhm.
going to get them with that message.
No.
The idea that, oh, rape is bad, they probably do know that and don't
Mhm.
care or can separate themselves from that in some regard. It's almost, we're just reinforcing the message amongst the people that are already aligned with it. And
Mhm.
I think that is some of the sentiment behind the idea of raise better men. I think it's trying to attack the idea of rape essentially,
Mhm.
and I think it's just kind of like this rallying cry that is misplaced, because we're
Yeah.
already, the people that that hear that and say, yeah, they're already raising good kids, like
Mhm.
they're already doing that. The
Mhm.
ones that don't hear that message and wouldn't care about the message are the ones that are going to perpetrate rape.
Yeah, I think a better
Mhm.
message is like talking about like how rape culture has existed
Mhm.
and like moving towards like creating consent culture. Just an example that comes to my head is like, you know, if someone is a professional athlete and they're like one of the best players on a professional team, and they have, you know, have allegations against them of like sexual violence. Oftentimes, you know, they're making a lot of money for that organization, whatever, and it's kind of swept under the rug, and like things like that that kind of like keep like this sort of like culture of this happens and it's not a big deal. I think
Mhm.
that is more of a topic than just like you know, it's not directly saying, oh, men need to be better, or like it's kind of like our culture as a whole.
Yeah. Accountability culture.
Yeah,
And I think that's
yeah,
where it needs, like, people need to be held accountable, and like having, what was it? It was like I don't remember who it was. My partner's really being into football. I think it's Deshaun Watson. That's not his name. That's not his name. His name's not Deshaun.
Deshaun. Yeah,
Deshaun
I
Watson,
think
and he had like
I think
he
so.
had a 7-game like recess where he couldn't play for 7 games, and that was it. I think, or it was like
As a result of some allegations.
it was like 20 plus allegations, and so like thinking about that, especially who usually watches football. Male
Guys.
identified,
Yeah,
male
yeah,
identified people, right?
right.
And so if that's also being shown as like,
But to be fair, most guys are not going to be that guy playing for a
no,
professional NFL
most
team.
people
Like,
are not playing
yeah,
professional,
yeah.
like
For
are not
sure.
professional athletes.
Yeah,
And so that's also like showing the accountability, though, because this
Yeah.
is somebody who is in media.
Yeah.
And it also perpetrates that rape culture of, you know, like boys will be boys.
Yeah.
And it's not right. And, you know, I think the narrative needs to be holding all people who cause harm accountable.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the narrative is males are perpetrators. And so a lot of the times there was also a campaign, years ago. It was Men Stop Rape was the campaign, was Men Stop Rape. And it was from like the early 2000s, 90s. We were still doing it when I started this work, and we had buttons that we would make, and then they would say like Men Stop Rape. And we didn't have any information on the campaign like out on our table, and we would always get people saying like, men experience sexual assault too, like, what is this? And we're like, yes. But the movement around it was that the main people who are perpetrating this violence are male identified. And so having males hold other males accountable in that. So like if somebody is making, like if there's like sexual harassment going on, if people are making, you know, rape jokes or those kinds of things, somebody else in that social circle holding that person accountable. Because if, you know, somebody on the outside, especially someone who's female identifying, coming into like a testosterone heavy group, and they're making jokes, and somebody says like, that joke's not appropriate, you're going to push that person inside and say like, shut up, you know, or like, oh, it was just a joke. But if it's another person in that friend group, or another person who's on that same kind of like social level or those kinds of things, holding that person accountable, you're more likely to hear your friend out than a stranger or somebody who you don't respect. So that was kind of for that movement. I don't know if it's still in existence. We don't put those buttons out anymore.
How do you guys work through I don't know how to phrase this, but rape fantasies, which I've heard that that's not the appropriate word to call them, but that's kind of, because it's not really rape. And I don't think anybody actually wants to experience a rape, but
Oh, like consensual non-consent. That like
is that
type
how
of-
you would phrase it?
I'm not sure.
I've only
Actually, an SVU episode about that.
a rape fantasy or
Yeah.
sexual.
Like within like people who are partners, that
Yeah,
type of
well,
thing.
Or they set it up, right? Like it's something where like somebody sets it up where it is where somebody is wanting to experience a sexual assault, but it's consensual in the sense of like they set it up and
it's
they
pre-planned,
yes,
premeditated.
it's a premeditated and they're okay with it.
Do you think that is problematic? Is that like
I don't
breeding
wanna
a
kink
culture?
shame
I mean,
anyone.
well,
I don't want to
it's
kink shame anyone, but personally, that's the face I'm just gonna make. No words, just a okay. You know, if that's somebody's fantasy, there might be something else lying underneath that. But
I dated a girl one time who wanted to go down that route, and she told me, and I was like, nope,
No.
well, you're not catching me up.
Yeah,
It like,
yeah,
no, thank you.
yeah,
But there's some girls who like the idea of maybe you coming over late at night and they just happen to leave the door unlocked, and it's different from rape 100%, but there's this weird, it's adjacent in some weird way, where if we're talking about problematic things, I don't know if you would add that into the category, there would be a discussion around that. I'm not really sure why that came into my head, but I was thinking about that and I wanted to ask.
Well, I think if there's that conversation before, right? If the
Because
two
it's just like us
parties
saying,
is,
oh, we're going to have sex tonight in some
Some
way.
way.
But then
Yeah,
it gets a little
at some
dicey.
time.
It gets a little dicey.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think if both parties are agreeing and okay with it, and it's consensual in that space for both of them, then that's consensual.
And there's like no gray area.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
if
I mean,
But do you think that's problematic in what it represents? Or am I just grasping at
no,
straws here?
I think it's really hard because it's also like it leads into other fantasies maybe for somebody who, you know, like porn, another culture like that. There's not the conversation of consent before the acts happen. And so for maybe somebody seeing that played out or hearing about it played out, that might elicit a fantasy. For somebody who has, you know, like full consent moving forward, like let's say you and your partner agree on this, you set you have a safe word, those kinds of things. You get to say no, and that person respects it. And there's consent based around that. Like, that's completely okay. You can do whatever you want in the bedroom as long as it's consensual in my eyes. If you want to do it, have fun. But I think on like the outside perspective, if somebody was like seeing this played out and didn't know the conversations or other things like that, that could elicit harm. I'm going to go on a tangent. The SVU episode I remember specifically watching, and this person was on like a kink website and set up with somebody to like break in and like have that kind of like rape fantasy. But the person who was assaulted, another person made like an account about them. So that person was assaulted, but the person who was the perpetrator was like, no, this was set up on a website. So then they had to figure out, Olivia Benson and them had to figure out who made the fake profile. On
Yeah,
the dating
that's
app.
dangerous.
That's-
That's right.
yeah, see,
yeah,
I'm
if you
like-
don't know the person.
Yeah.
Like,
So like
ugh.
that person really woke up and was assaulted, and the person like left as part of like the fantasy. And then they found out who that person was, and they were like, no, this person invited me over. Like, this is their profile and all of this stuff. It was very wild to watch.
Yeah,
Very
that would be a
entertaining.
tough. I would not want the job of unpacking that.
No,
That's-
I was sitting there and I was like, wait a minute. And that's the first time, like, when you said that, I was like, that was the first time I ever knew that was a fantasy.
Yeah. I definitely like talking about what we were talking about earlier and like the culture of things. I definitely do think that and it's kind of a little bit aligned with that like fantasy of like sexual violence. I do think you know, a large part of pornography is pretty problematic with like how it displays violence as like sexual violence and like extreme things as like a normal.
Well, choking. How prevalent is choking now?
Right?
Very high up there.
Yeah.
And it's also like there's safe ways to do it too, and that's never modeled in these things. So it's just kind of like this fantasy,
Right.
this obtainable thing.
Yeah.
And there's never conversations of consent or if it's okay
Yeah.
or
And
safe words.
Those scenes, it's never showing before like, okay, is this okay? Is this
Mhm.
not? It's just like straight into it, you know? So, yeah.
Well, porn
And
is
there's-
just an interesting case study on almost society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see how we look back like 200 years from now
Mhm.
on porn, and if people oppose how we handled it or if
Mhm.
we handled it the right way.
Well, even exposure. I mean,
Exposure, especially to kids.
Oh,
man.
yeah. I was
Kids
gonna
having
say,
access to
middle
that is
school.
crazy.
I mean,
middle school,
I
they
know
talk about they have it on their phones, and I'm
Yeah.
sitting there, I'm like, you're 12. How do you even,
Yeah.
know to have access to this or to look this
I mean,
up?
like me at that age, I had
Mhm.
access, like
Mhm.
6th, 7th grade.
Wild.
Not ideal,
That has to be.
especially like what type of porn is most prevalent on like the main sites. Like
Mhm.
I do acknowledge like there are like there is better sexual content out there that people put out, and it's not like um this like really violent like these really violent like super extreme scenes, but yeah.
But even that is a slippery slope because
Mhm.
what determines problematic, right? If
Yeah.
it's two consenting adults that,
Yeah.
I mean, you would hope that the people that are doing it actually want to be there and
Yeah.
want to do this
Mhm.
and are not forced in some way. But
Yeah.
if they both want to be there and want to engage in this type of activity,
Yeah.
how do you handle?
I
Like
just think
what?
like the overexposure of really violent things can like kind of set people up to think maybe that's how it is and like want that from their partner, and when really those things aren't, they're just really normalized within that industry. So I think that part can be problematic. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That kind of ties back into the sexualizing kids thing, which I think
Mhm.
everybody would agree is a problem. The idea that we're sexualizing kids, but then there's the problem of what does that mean?
Mhm.
Because kids, like you said, kids are sexualized in some regards. And how do you combat? I mean, we were all in middle school once.
Mhm.
This is gonna be a throwback reference. You guys, I don't even know if I should go here, but I'm gonna. The two girls, one cup
Oh yeah.
phenomenon.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I think I saw that maybe sixth grade,
Mhm.
maybe younger, maybe like fourth or fifth. No, maybe sixth grade. But
Mhm.
that's pretty crazy for a sixth grader to see. That would be
Yeah.
pretty crazy for really anybody to see. But
Mhm.
that you just see that if you're a kid and you have access to even if you don't have access to the internet, if you were a kid around other kids,
You had access,
you have
and so
access
you
Mhm.
to
have
some crazy.
Right.
access.
Somebody's gonna find something that's crazy and
Uh-huh.
show everybody
Mhm.
just to say this is crazy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember like it was like 4th grade was the first time that I ever saw like pornography,
Mhm.
and it was one of the boys in the back of the bus saw it on like his brother's computer or something and took a video of it on his like flip phone and like was showing it to people. And so it's also like if you have older siblings and like all these other things, because like I was around like middle school when I saw like Two Girls, One Cup, and then like there was like the sandbox one. I don't. There was a lot of
There's a
different ones.
lot.
There's a
There's a
lot of
lot.
different ones. It became a wormhole very quickly, um, and it was also kind of like not like a rite of passage, but like everybody was talking about it. You wanted to see it because everyone was talking about it. And they're like, "Oh, this is so messed up." Like
You
you
weren't cool
have
if you
to
didn't
see
see
it.
it. You had to be
Mhm.
you. It was society
Yeah,
in
yeah.
middle school or in
Mhm.
elementary school. Like these are the cultural things that they just happen. Nobody would
Mhm.
want that to happen to their kids, but that's just you go through that.
Yeah, you saw it. I don't know how much stuff I saw on my family's literal like
Too much,
desktop
way too
computer
much. I could
in
say.
the like the computer room. I was like, who's
Yeah.
monitoring this?
Yeah.
We talk about
Yeah.
this all the time. Like, who was monitoring me on like MySpace? No
Well, and
one.
things that your friends would show you, or
Oh
if you
yeah.
were playing sports and you were, I mean, in the dugout, I saw some crazy stuff because it's just you guys are waiting, you're waiting to go up to bat or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and you're just somebody's going down a rabbit hole and they're showing everybody. And how do you combat that? And more
Mm-hmm.
so, how do you combat that without infringing on people's rights and on parental rights? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard too, because like, and also like as another kid. So even if you don't want to see it, and you're like, oh, this makes me sick or whatever,
you're seeing it.
you're seeing it, and then if you're like, no, I don't want to see it, or you tell the adult, you don't want to be that kid.
You don't want to,
You
nobody
don't
wants
want
to be that
nobody
kid.
wants to be that kid. And so then it's also then like you're in that limbo if I say something or even if something's not okay and I say something like I'm gonna be ostracized, I'm gonna get made fun of. So I'd rather just sit here and watch it. That's hard.
Yeah, it's almost like we've opened Pandora's box in
Yeah.
some regards, just through our progress in society.
Mm-hmm.
And now people recognize that there are some problems, but nobody has a real tangible way of reeling things back in.
Yeah.
And so that's like the buzzword of sexualizing kids. Yeah, nobody would agree with doing that, but what does that look like? How do we not
Mm-hmm.
do that? And you do have the counter argument of, like you said, teaching kids about their bodies and about these things. Maybe that exposes a kid to the words needed to express something that they went through. So if
Mhm.
some kid hadn't gone to one of your guys' teachings or something and had been sexually assaulted, wouldn't know that that's wrong or wouldn't have the words to express what happened to them because
Mhm.
they never went through a lecture like your guys's.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we aren't necessarily like teaching about body parts and stuff like that. They have like separate sex ed programs, and
At
we're
the high
more
school,
like
yeah.
Okay.
consent.
Yeah, not necessarily you guys, but
Relationships.
going through a program
Sure,
like that.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
No. Well, it opens doors, and then I had a thought. It might be gone.
I hate when
It
that
I
happens.
had one
It
of those.
happens.
I think I had 2 of those. Right?
Yeah. What was I gonna say? Oh,
Sexualizing
oh.
kids.
When we're talking about anatomy, I think it's also super important to us like break that barrier of like our bodies aren't inherently sexual.
Mhm.
These are just our bodies,
Right.
and that we all have bodies. And so I think like when we're just talking about bodies after like harm has happened or like in through the lens of harm, then I think it adds to the like the
Mm.
like the sexualization of it in a way, because then it's like, oh, we're only addressing these parts of your body regarding sex instead of just like basic health.
Making it into like a taboo thing.
So like if we don't talk about it and then harm happens and then we start talking about it, or certain things happen and we only talk about it around like if someone starts their period or things like that, so then it becomes taboo. Because if the conversation has always been these are our body parts, this is part of our basic anatomy, we have an arm, a hand, and a vagina, there's it's a piece of our body, or those kinds of things, and it kind of just becomes normalized, and not in the sense of normal through like sexualization, but just as us as a being, which I think is important for kids to also recognize that like their whole body is a part of themselves, and their private parts aren't just some like detached anomaly to them.
Yeah, it's a tricky road to walk. I
I'm
mean,
not a parent, and I'm gonna preface that I am not a parent.
yeah, this is coming from a group of people who are not parents.
Yep.
Preface that. We're just
yeah.
spitballing here.
Yeah, well, because we get asked from like parents all the time too, like, or even like on the hotline if harm happens, or like, well, what have you experienced? And I'm like, I'm not a parent, but potty regression or like different things like that. So you can name some levels, but also I don't want to give somebody parenting advice. I don't want to be put in that position of like, this is how you should parent your kids, because I feel like that's very, that's very personal and how you want to raise your kid, and you're raising somebody, and I wouldn't want somebody to do that to me, because I'm going to probably raise my kids differently than somebody else would, and they're going to raise their kids different than that. I have to do that with and remember that with my family of like, oh, this isn't my kid.
Yeah, I don't know. We're in an interesting time on a lot of different fronts, to say the least, right?
Yeah, and I feel like things are moving like in a positive way, like towards the future, and like having these conversations. I mean, even just through like the Me Too movement and the normalization of having these conversations. I mean, talking about rape culture as a whole, and like even just like our systems at play, and like systematically where things are not benefiting survivors. I think it's important to have these conversations and like bring them to the light even when they're uncomfortable. Um and like to talk about different views and have those kind of conversations, because I mean, intimacy and sex is so private for so many people, and so is sexualized violence, and they're different. And so when there's that like betrayal and that those lines are blurred, it's like when is it okay to talk about sex and when is it okay to talk about sexualized violence, and like what does that look like? And just in these few years of like being in education and being in the schools, like these kids, you walk in a room and you're like, what does consent mean? And they'll tell you permission, you have to ask, it is mutual, it's affirmative. They're able to use this language and like have an understanding of that, which I think is super empowering. And when I was doing this work at 2021, that wasn't the case. And so, the growth within that and the comfortability in the conversations has grown. And I think a lot of it starts at home, because if you talk with your kids about certain things, like it's going to be more comfortable to talk about with others. And there's pros and cons to everything. And so, I mean, from what I've experienced, I see like a really good forward trajectory on these conversations and people understanding consent and how to treat others with respect. Because I think that's like the baseline when you talk about respect and you talk about boundaries. It's treating people with mutual respect, which should be a common thread throughout every aspect of people's lives. And so I feel like it lays the framework for a lot of other intersections in people's lives.
Yeah, I think we're making progress. I think society as a whole is good about moving forward. It just doesn't always happen as fast as people would want in some
Yeah.
ways.
And there's some people who really don't want it. So, and those people are gonna fight for what they believe in. And I'm in a stance of like I'm gonna stand up for what I believe in, and I hope people do the same for themselves.
Do you guys get a lot of pushback against the organization just in general, or
Not really.
that's a good sign?
Not really. Not anymore. I mean, like I said, we get like the side eyes, those kinds of things. We don't really typically get people like coming up to us and saying like you need to leave or like those
Well, you
kinds
guys
of
aren't a
things.
controversial
No,
group. Like you guys are out here just providing support for
Yeah.
those that need it.
people don't like the word rape. And so I think that's also like when we go into schools, we use different verbiage for who we are. Sometimes like we'll say like we're a part of our CAP program, Child Abuse Prevention Program, housed under the North Coast Rape Crisis Team.
Isn't it good? Isn't in a sense the word is good that it elicits that response, because you wouldn't want it to be something
Too
that
normalized.
that you could just walk by. But when you hear rape, it's everybody
Like, oh,
perks up because you
mhm.
know it's something serious.
Yeah. So I mean it's good and bad. And so and we'll continue to change our verbiage and our language, and we're going to talk about the same things. So whether you like the North Coast Rape Crisis Team as an agency or the Child Abuse Prevention Program as an agency, we're going to come in and we're going to talk about stuff. And I think that's really important to continue to show up. We don't get a lot of like societal pushback around things, because I mean, we're a service agency. And so when people are coming to us, they've experienced harm in some capacity. And so if you don't want people to receive services from harm that they've experienced,
Got some questions.
you got some questions.
Yeah.
You got some questions. So,
Okay, well, guys, we've done 2 hours. We could wrap
my
this up. Yeah,
gosh,
we've been in
Nick.
here for a minute. I
Okay.
kept you guys for a while. Do you want to plug all of your resources, where people can find the website, all your stuff, any social media, anything like that?
yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So we are on Instagram under NCRCT Humboldt. We're also on Facebook as the North Coast Rape Crisis Team. You can find our website at ncrct.org. We have volunteer opportunities as well as some part-time job opportunities as well. So if you look under our website and join our team, that'll give some information. If you're interested in being a volunteer with our agency, our next cohort is going to start in August. On our website, you can access the volunteer application and connect with us through that way. We also have a 24-hour hotline, which is 445-2881. Right?
Yep.
Okay. We have 2 of them, and I always get them mixed up. One's 465-2851. Okay. And then we also have our business line. So if anyone wants to have any like inquiries or questions about our agency, you can give that a call, and that number is 707-443-2737.
Yeah. And just thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you so
thank you guys for
much.
coming
Yeah.
on. It was
Yeah, sorry for talking your
it was
ear
a
off.
lot of fun, difficult conversation.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of like a double-edged sword saying that, but I
Yeah.
really appreciate you guys coming on. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah,
Enjoyed
for
this.
sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, and good to meet you.
Good to
Yeah.
meet